Getting caught doing something wrong puts people in an uncomfortable position where they have to face consequences for their actions. The smart response is accepting responsibility, apologizing sincerely, and dealing with whatever punishment comes their way with dignity and maturity. These people chose a different path, one paved with lies so spectacularly stupid they made everything infinitely worse than it needed to be. 1. Someone pulled over for speeding, told the police officer their dog had been driving, pointing to their pet in the passenger seat as evidence. The driver claimed they'd been teaching their dog to drive, and the dog had accidentally pressed the gas pedal too hard while practicing. The officer stared in disbelief as the driver insisted the dog was responsible for the speeding violation and should receive the ticket instead. When asked how the dog reached the pedals while sitting in the passenger seat, the driver claimed the dog was very talented and stretched. The excuse resulted in additional charges for lying to a police officer on top of the original speeding ticket. The driver apparently believed blaming an animal incapable of operating vehicles was more believable than admitting they were speeding. 2. A student caught cheating on an exam claimed they weren't cheating but were actually telepathically communicating with their future self, who had already taken the test. The student explained they had been receiving answers from their future consciousness that had traveled back in time to help. When the professor pointed out they'd been looking directly at another student's paper, they insisted they were actually looking through that student at a temporal portal. The explanation included elaborate details about time travel mechanics and how future knowledge worked. The professor failed them for both cheating and insulting their intelligence with an impossibly stupid excuse. The student apparently thought claiming psychic time travel powers was more believable than admitting they'd copied answers. 3. Someone caught shoplifting told security they were actually an undercover quality control inspector testing the store's anti-theft systems. They claimed corporate headquarters had sent them to evaluate security response times and that their theft was authorized testing. When security asked for credentials or contact information for their supposed employer, they said everything was classified for security purposes. They insisted that arresting them would interfere with an important corporate security audit. Security called the police anyway, who confirmed the person had no affiliation with the company and was simply a shoplifter with an elaborate story. The excuse transformed simple shoplifting into a situation involving false impersonation of corporate authority. 4. A driver caught running a red light told the officer they were colorblind and couldn't tell which light was illuminated. When the officer pointed out that traffic lights are positioned specifically so colorblind people can tell by position which light is on, they changed their story to claim they were also positionally challenged. They insisted their spatial awareness disorder made it impossible to determine which position the lights were in. The officer noted that if they couldn't determine traffic light positions, they shouldn't have a driver's license. The excuse resulted in the original ticket plus a referral for license suspension review. The driver apparently preferred admitting to multiple disabilities that would make them unfit to drive rather than accepting a simple traffic violation. 5. Someone caught vandalizing property claimed they were actually an artist creating unsolicited public installations, and that vandalism charges violated their freedom of expression. They insisted their graffiti was social commentary that improved the community and demanded recognition as a misunderstood artist. When property owners showed documentation of damage costs, they argued that art shouldn't be valued in monetary terms. They claimed future generations would recognize their graffiti as culturally significant, and that current prosecution was artistic censorship. The judge was not impressed by the art defense and imposed maximum penalties for vandalism. The excuse elevated simple property damage into a pretentious manifesto about the nature of art. 6. A student caught plagiarizing a paper claimed they hadn't plagiarized but had accidentally channeled the original author's spirit through automatic writing. They explained they had been possessed by the deceased writer's ghost, who wanted their words shared with new audiences. When the professor noted the plagiarized work was from a living author's recent publication, they claimed that author was also channeling the same spirit. The excuse required believing that spirits were dictating identical passages to multiple people across time. The professor failed the assignment and reported the incident to academic integrity boards. The student apparently thought supernatural possession was more believable than admitting they'd copied someone's work. 7. Someone caught speeding in a school zone told police they were rushing home because they'd accidentally left their oven on and their house was possibly on fire. Police offered to escort them home to check on the emergency, at which point they changed their story to claim they'd just remembered they'd actually turned the oven off. When officers became suspicious about the changing story, they claimed they were manifesting a house fire as part of the law of attraction visualization techniques. The excuse evolved through 3 different stories before officers finally issued the ticket. The driver apparently thought fake emergencies and pseudoscience were better than admitting they hadn't noticed the speed limit. 8. A worker caught sleeping at their desk claimed they weren't sleeping but were practicing vertical meditation, required by their personal wellness routine. They insisted their eyes had been closed for enhanced focus, and the snoring had been therapeutic breathing techniques. When their boss mentioned the drool on their keyboard, they claimed that was from hydration meditation that required allowing saliva to flow naturally. They argued that their meditation practice made them more productive and should be accommodated. The excuse resulted in a written warning for both sleeping and insulting their supervisor's intelligence. The employee apparently believed corporate wellness culture would excuse napping at their desk. 9. Someone caught littering told the park ranger they were actually conducting a longitudinal study on decomposition rates and had deliberately placed trash to monitor environmental breakdown. They claimed their littering was science and that removing the trash would compromise their research data. When the ranger asked for research permits or institutional affiliation, they said citizen science didn't require formal authorization. They insisted their trash was carefully placed experimental material rather than simple littering. The excuse resulted in fines for littering and disturbing a natural area for fake research purposes. The person apparently thought claiming scientific motivation would excuse throwing garbage in a park. 10. A student caught skipping class told the principal they hadn't skipped, but had been abducted by aliens who returned them to the wrong time period. They provided elaborate details about the spacecraft, alien beings, and time dilation effects that explained their absence. When the principal noted they'd been seen at a local mall during class time, they claimed that was their alien clone conducting reconnaissance. The excuse included explanations about intergalactic technology and why their absence couldn't be punished due to circumstances beyond human control. The principal suspended them for both skipping class and wasting administrative time with nonsense stories. The student apparently thought extraterrestrial abduction was more believable than admitting they'd gone shopping. 11. Someone caught drunk driving told police they weren't actually drunk but had just used mouthwash that contained alcohol, and that's why they failed the breathalyzer. When police noted mouthwash couldn't produce blood alcohol levels over 3 times the legal limit, they claimed they'd used an entire bottle of mouthwash for extreme oral hygiene. They insisted they were a victim of overzealous dental care habits. Police pointed out that drinking a bottle of mouthwash would constitute alcohol consumption anyway. The excuse demonstrated such poor understanding of both chemistry and law that additional charges were considered. The driver apparently thought weaponized dental hygiene was more believable than admitting they'd been drinking. 12. A student caught with exam answers written on their hand claimed they weren't cheat notes but were actually grocery lists they'd forgotten to wash off. When the professor pointed out the grocery list exactly matched exam questions and answers, they insisted it was an amazing coincidence that their shopping needs aligned perfectly with test content. They argued that prosecuting them for shopping lists would set a dangerous precedent for innocent note-taking. The excuse required believing someone would grocery shop for items like mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. The professor failed them and reported them for academic dishonesty and insulting reasoning capabilities. 13. Someone caught stealing from work claimed they weren't stealing but were actually borrowing items indefinitely until they possibly decided to return them eventually. They argued that intent to maybe return something transformed theft into extended borrowing. When management noted they'd taken items home permanently without permission or documentation, they insisted workplace culture had implied unlimited borrowing privileges. They claimed being fired for borrowing was discrimination against their personal property interpretation philosophy. The excuse resulted in termination and criminal charges, as indefinite secret borrowing is definitionally theft. The employee apparently thought redefining theft would change its legal consequences. 14. A driver caught in a hit and run told police they hadn't realized they'd hit another car, despite obvious damage to both vehicles. They claimed they'd thought the loud crash and impact was a pothole or possibly thunder. When confronted with video evidence showing them clearly hitting a parked car, then driving away, they adjusted their story to claim they'd been having a dissociative episode. The excuse evolved from impossible obliviousness to convenient mental health claims. Police noted that if they experienced dissociative episodes while driving, they shouldn't have a license. The excuse turned a simple accident into felony hit and run with additional false reporting charges. 15. Someone caught cheating on their partner claimed they weren't cheating but were conducting a social experiment to test relationship boundaries and trust dynamics. They insisted their infidelity was actually research into human bonding patterns and should be appreciated as scientific inquiry. When their partner pointed out the absence of consent or disclosure about this experiment, they claimed blind studies required deception to be valid. The excuse transformed betrayal into pretentious pseudoscience that made everything worse. The relationship ended not just from the cheating, but from the insulting attempt to reframe it as research. The person apparently thought academic language would excuse infidelity. 16. A student caught looking at their phone during an exam claimed they weren't cheating but were checking the time because they'd forgotten their watch. When the professor noted the exam room had 3 visible clocks, they insisted those clocks were giving them anxiety, and they needed personal time verification. When caught with exam answers on their phone screen, they claimed those were notes for a different class they'd forgotten to close. The excuse evolved through multiple contradictory explanations as each lie was exposed. The professor filed academic dishonesty reports for both the cheating and the subsequent lying during the investigation. 17. Someone caught speeding through a residential neighborhood told police they were being chased by bees and needed to outrun the swarm. When officers pointed out it was winter and no bees were present, they claimed the bees had been inside their car and they'd since escaped. When asked why they hadn't simply stopped and exited the vehicle, they insisted these were specially trained attack bees that understood doors. The excuse required believing in weaponized bees that pursued vehicles through neighborhoods, but gave up once the driver reached higher speeds. The absurd lie resulted in tickets for speeding, reckless driving, and wasting police time with ridiculous stories. 18. A worker caught browsing social media instead of working claimed they weren't wasting time but were conducting competitive intelligence research on industry trends. They insisted Instagram and TikTok were valuable sources of market research critical to their job performance. When their supervisor noted their job had nothing to do with social media, they argued all modern work required digital literacy and trend awareness. They claimed disciplining them for research would stifle innovation and harm the company's competitive position. The excuse transformed clear time theft into delusional justifications about business strategy, resulting in termination. 19. Someone caught parking in a handicapped space without a permit claimed they were handicapped by extreme laziness and that not accommodating their condition was discrimination. They insisted their aversion to walking constituted a legitimate disability that deserved accommodation. When informed that laziness isn't a recognized disability, they argued that medical science hadn't caught up to understanding their condition. They threatened legal action for disability discrimination. The excuse resulted in maximum parking fines and potential charges for abusing handicapped parking. The person apparently thought declaring themselves disabled by laziness would excuse illegal parking. 20. A student caught forging a parent's signature on a permission slip claimed they weren't forging but were practicing their calligraphy, and the signature was purely artistic expression. When the teacher noted the fake signature was on an actual permission form that provided school authorization, they insisted the document was their canvas, and they hadn't realized its functional purpose. They argued that punishing artistic expression would violate their creative rights. The excuse required believing they'd accidentally created perfect forgeries while doing art practice on school documents. The school suspended them for forgery and contacted parents about the fake signature. 21. Someone caught breaking noise ordinances late at night told police they weren't making noise but were actually testing whether neighbors were properly alert, and that their complaints proved the community watch system worked. They claimed their loud music was a security service ensuring neighborhood vigilance. When police explained noise ordinances weren't suspended for vigilante security testing, they insisted they deserved gratitude for keeping everyone alert. The excuse transformed disturbing the peace into delusional community service justifications. Multiple noise violation fines were issued along with warnings that continued disturbances would result in arrest for disorderly conduct. 22. A worker caught lying on their resume claimed they hadn't lied but had listed aspirational qualifications, representing who they intended to become rather than current reality. They insisted resume writing allowed creative interpretation of potential future skills. When confronted about claiming degrees they didn't have and experience at companies where they'd never worked, they argued they were manifesting their career trajectory through positive affirmations. They claimed firing them for aspirational thinking would discourage ambition. The excuse resulted in immediate termination for fraud and blacklisting in their industry for falsifying credentials. 23. Someone caught shoplifting told security they were actually trying to help the store by identifying security weaknesses in their theft prevention systems. They claimed taking merchandise was unauthorized security consulting that should be appreciated. When security pointed out that security testing requires permission and formal engagement, they insisted entrepreneurial innovation didn't need authorization. They demanded payment for their security assessment services. The excuse elevated shoplifting to delusional consulting claims, resulting in arrest and trespassing bans from the store. 24. A student caught talking during a test claimed they weren't cheating, but were having a conversation with their guardian angel who was providing spiritual guidance. They insisted the answers came from divine sources and that preventing angelic communication violated their religious freedom. When the teacher noted they'd been clearly discussing answers with the student next to them, they claimed that student was also receiving messages from the same angel. The excuse required believing angels delivered exam answers through what appeared to be regular student conversations. The teacher failed both students and reported them for coordinated cheating. 25. Someone caught running a red light told police they were following the spirit of traffic laws rather than the literal interpretation, and that red lights were merely suggestions about optimal crossing times. They argued that when no other cars were present, red lights became advisory rather than mandatory. When informed that's not how traffic laws work, they insisted strict law interpretation stifled driver judgment and autonomy. They claimed their sophisticated understanding of traffic flow made them better qualified than traffic signals to determine safe crossing. The excuse resulted in tickets and a lecture about how traffic laws aren't philosophical debates. 26. A worker caught eating a coworker's clearly labeled lunch from the shared office refrigerator claimed they weren't stealing food, but had reasonably assumed that anything stored in the communal fridge was implicitly communal property based on general office sharing culture. When the coworker showed their name clearly and prominently labeled on the container in permanent marker, they insisted the labeling was ambiguous and could easily have been brand information rather than ownership designation. They argued that bringing personal lunch to a shared workplace environment implied willingness to share with the broader office community. The excuse somehow managed to transform obvious lunch theft into elaborate philosophical justifications about communal property rights, resulting in formal HR complaints and required financial reimbursement for the stolen food. 27. Someone caught littering by throwing trash from their car window told the environmental enforcement officer they were actually feeding local wildlife by strategically distributing food wrappers that animals could lick for remaining food particles and nutritional residue. They claimed their littering was actually ecological support for struggling urban animal populations. When informed that feeding wildlife is also illegal in that area, and that trash actively harms animals, they insisted that controlled exposure to processed foods built stronger animal immune systems. The excuse managed to make the original violation significantly worse by adding wildlife harassment charges to the littering citations. Multiple substantial fines were issued for various environmental violations and for deliberately disturbing protected wildlife. 28. A student caught directly copying homework assignments claimed they weren't copying, but were engaged in collaborative learning practices that modern progressive education should actively encourage. They insisted that working together by having one person complete all the work while others copied the results represented effective and efficient team dynamics. When the teacher explained that genuine collaborative learning involves actual collaboration and shared work, rather than one person doing everything while others copy, they argued that their method was simply more efficient than traditional collaboration. They claimed being punished for efficient collaboration would discourage teamwork and cooperative learning. The excuse resulted in zeros for all students involved and mandatory lessons about what actual collaboration means. 29. Someone caught speeding dramatically through a clearly marked construction zone told police they were actually speeding to minimize the total time spent in the dangerous construction area, and that slower driving would have paradoxically increased accident risk by extending exposure time. They argued their excessive speed was actually an advanced safety measure protecting construction workers. When police explained that construction zone speed limits exist specifically and scientifically for worker safety, based on stopping distances and reaction times, they insisted they personally knew better than professional traffic engineers. The excuse demonstrated such spectacularly backwards logic that the officer added reckless driving citations to the original speeding charges. 30. A worker caught watching full-length movies at their desk during work hours claimed they weren't wasting time but were studying cinematography and narrative structure techniques to improve their business communication skills and presentation abilities. They insisted that analyzing film and storytelling enhanced their ability to present information effectively in professional contexts. When their manager noted their actual job involved data entry with absolutely no presentation component whatsoever, they argued that all professional development was inherently valuable, regardless of immediate practical applicability to current roles. The excuse somehow managed to transform clear policy violation into pretentious justifications about holistic professional growth, resulting in formal written warnings and performance improvement plans. 31. Someone caught urinating in public told responding police officers they weren't committing indecent exposure, but were responding to an acute medical emergency that temporarily excused normal social norms and public decency standards. When police explained that public urination remains illegal regardless of claimed urgency and that public bathrooms were available within a short walking distance, they claimed their specific urination needs required immediate outdoor relief that couldn't wait for proper facilities. They argued that fundamental human biological functions couldn't be reasonably regulated by arbitrary governmental laws. The excuse resulted in public indecency charges and mandatory community service hours, cleaning public spaces they'd personally contributed to defiling with their behavior. 32. A student caught with extensive prohibited materials during an exam claimed the materials obviously belonged to whoever had previously sat at that particular desk, and they'd only just discovered them immediately before the test started. When the professor noted the materials clearly had the student's own name written on them in their handwriting, they insisted someone must have deliberately forged their identity specifically to frame them for academic dishonesty. They claimed they were innocent victims of an elaborate cheating conspiracy targeting honest students. The excuse required believing someone had planted damning evidence in the student's own handwriting, specifically to frame them. The professor failed them immediately and noted the particularly insulting nature of such a transparent and obvious lie. 33. Someone caught trespassing on clearly marked private property claimed they weren't trespassing but were simply exercising their natural inherent right to travel freely anywhere on Earth without respecting artificial human boundaries. They insisted property rights were arbitrary societal constructs that didn't supersede their fundamental freedom of movement. When property owners cited extensive legal precedent supporting property rights, they claimed those laws were invalid because they personally hadn't consented to them. The excuse escalated simple trespassing into full sovereign citizen philosophical territory, resulting in arrest and significant legal consequences. The person apparently thought philosophical objections to the entire concept of property law would somehow prevent its enforcement. 34. A driver caught texting while driving told police they weren't texting at all but were using their phone exclusively as a GPS navigation device that was just poorly mounted on their lap. When police noted the obvious texting conversation clearly visible on the screen, they claimed they were dictating GPS destinations through speech-to-text functionality. When asked why GPS destinations looked exactly like casual social conversations, including, "LOL, what are you doing later?" they insisted modern GPS systems had evolved conversational interfaces. The excuse required police to believe GPS navigation systems text messages like, "OMG, that's so funny," as directional guidance. The distracted driving ticket was issued along with detailed notes about the driver insulting officer intelligence. 35. Someone caught plagiarizing an entire essay word for word claimed they hadn't plagiarized anything, but had independently arrived at identical conclusions, using identical words through parallel thinking processes. They insisted the matching text was pure coincidental similarity, resulting from analyzing the same source materials through similar logical frameworks. When shown that entire paragraphs matched published academic work word for word, including specific examples and citations, they argued that great minds naturally think alike and produce remarkably similar prose. The excuse required believing they'd accidentally recreated complex original arguments using identical sentence structures purely by chance. The academic dishonesty resulted in course failure and formal academic probation. 36. A worker caught systematically stealing time by clocking in but not actually working claimed they weren't stealing but were practicing mindfulness and meditation during work hours as essential self-care for mental health maintenance. They insisted their wellness practices made them significantly more productive during their actual active work periods. When management noted they were being paid to work rather than meditate on company time, they claimed employers had legal obligations to support employee mental health needs. They argued that preventing meditation constituted workplace discrimination against mental health practices. The excuse transformed obvious time theft into demands for paid meditation time, resulting in immediate termination for timesheet fraud. 37. Someone caught vandalizing a public statue claimed they were actually performing important historical revisionism to correct inaccurate historical representations and should be thanked for educational improvement rather than prosecuted. They insisted their unauthorized alterations provided crucial historical context the original artwork intentionally omitted. When charged with destruction of public property, they argued their additions constituted protected speech and important cultural commentary. They claimed arresting them was censorship of legitimate historical correction efforts. The excuse elevated simple vandalism to completely delusional activism justifications, resulting in criminal charges and court-ordered restitution requirements covering full restoration costs. 38. A student caught using detailed, unauthorized notes during an exam claimed the notes weren't prohibited materials, but were actually religious texts they were legally entitled to have for spiritual support during stressful situations. When the professor examined the supposed religious texts and found exam-specific chemistry information, they claimed their religion was very specific and had exam-focused sacred writings. They insisted that questioning their religious needs constituted violation of religious freedom protections. The excuse required believing their religion's holy texts contained specific answers to organic chemistry questions about molecular bonding. The professor failed them immediately and reported the fraudulent religious accommodation claim to administration. 39. Someone caught illegally dumping large amounts of trash told environmental officers they were creating an experimental art installation about consumerism and waste in modern society, rather than simply disposing of garbage illegally. They claimed their illegal dumping was protected artistic expression and meaningful environmental commentary. When charged with illegal dumping violations, they insisted authorities were demonstrating they didn't understand contemporary art's provocative nature and social commentary functions. They demanded recognition as environmental artists rather than prosecution as criminals. The excuse transformed environmental crime into pretentious art claims, resulting in maximum fines for illegal disposal plus all removal and cleanup costs. 40. A worker caught taking extended breaks far beyond policy limits claimed they weren't violating break policies, but were practicing interval productivity techniques that required longer rest periods for optimal performance based on their personal productivity system. They insisted their individualized productivity system produced objectively better results than traditional rigid work schedules. When management noted they were paid for specific contracted hours, regardless of personal productivity philosophies, they argued that ultimate output and results mattered more than arbitrary time requirements. They claimed rigid time requirements stifled their innovative work approach and creative processes. The excuse turned clear policy violation into lengthy debates about productivity philosophy, resulting in formal disciplinary action for unauthorized schedule modifications. 41. Someone caught running multiple red lights in quick succession told police they were colorblind and all the lights looked identical to them. When police pointed out that traffic lights are specifically positioned so colorblind people can determine which light is illuminated by position alone, they claimed they were also spatially confused and couldn't process positional information. When asked how they'd passed their driving test with these serious impairments, they insisted their conditions had developed suddenly and coincidentally that very day. The excuse required believing multiple disabilities appeared simultaneously at the convenient moment of a traffic stop. The license suspension process was initiated based on their self-reported inability to safely operate vehicles. 42. A student caught blatantly cheating on a take-home exam claimed they hadn't cheated, but had consulted with their pet cat about the answers, and the cat had provided surprisingly accurate information through some kind of animal intelligence. They insisted their cat genuinely understood the complex material and had helped them study through inexplicable feline wisdom. When the professor noted several answers matched other students exactly word for word, they claimed multiple students had all consulted the same remarkably intelligent cat, who was apparently tutoring the entire class. The excuse required believing a cat was providing identical tutoring to multiple students. The academic dishonesty resulted in failure and referral to student conduct boards, specifically for the absurd and insulting justification attempt. 43. Someone caught speeding, told police their accelerator pedal had gotten stuck, and they were physically unable to slow the vehicle down despite their best efforts. When police noted they'd been seen smoothly braking at a stop sign just minutes before being pulled over, they quickly changed their story to claim the accelerator was intermittently sticking in an unpredictable pattern. When asked the obvious question about why they hadn't pulled over immediately to address such a dangerous mechanical issue, they insisted they were trying to reach a mechanic's shop. The excuse evolved through multiple obvious contradictions as each lie was systematically exposed. The speeding ticket was issued along with a mandatory vehicle safety inspection order. 44. A worker caught falsifying timesheets claimed they weren't falsifying anything, but were reporting spiritual time they'd worked mentally while physically absent, which should legitimately count as compensable work hours. They insisted that thinking about work outside official work hours deserved financial compensation for mental labor. When management explained that actual physical presence was required for payroll purposes under labor law, they argued modern work didn't require physical presence, and their thoughts were valuable contributions. They claimed discrimination for not properly valuing their mental labor contributions. The excuse resulted in immediate termination for fraud and demands to repay wages for hours not actually worked. 45, and finally, someone caught faking their own death to avoid substantial debt obligations told investigators they hadn't actually faked death, but had experienced a profound spiritual rebirth that created an entirely new person, no longer bound by the previous person's legal and financial obligations. They insisted with complete seriousness that their old self had died spiritually, and their new spiritually reborn self shouldn't be held responsible for the previous incarnation's debts and commitments. When firmly informed that spiritual rebirth doesn't erase actual legal obligations under any jurisdiction's laws, they argued religious freedom meant their spiritual transformation should be legally recognized and honored. They claimed forcing their new spiritual identity to pay old debts violated their rights to religious belief and practice. The excuse spectacularly escalated fraud charges by adding fake death to existing debt evasion, and the person discovered that pretending to die comes with severe legal consequences, including substantial fines, potential jail time, and making absolutely everything worse than simply dealing with debt. The spiritual rebirth defense convinced exactly nobody in the legal system, and they learned the hard way that sometimes the worst possible excuse is one that adds multiple additional crimes to your original problem while insulting everyone's intelligence. Here's the fundamental truth these stories demonstrate. When caught doing something wrong, the elaborate excuse almost never works better than simple honesty and genuine acceptance of responsibility. The core problem is that admitting fault feels acutely worse in the immediate moment than inventing an excuse, even when that excuse is transparently ridiculous and obviously false to everyone else. What separates minor troubles from major disasters is often the quality of the excuse attempted. A simple, sincere apology might result in a warning or minimal consequences, while claiming your dog was driving gets you extra charges for lying to law enforcement. The worse and more insulting the excuse, the more likely it transforms a small, manageable problem into a significant disaster. These excuses failed catastrophically because they were either easily disprovable with basic evidence, logically impossible under known physics and biology, or so insulting to everyone's intelligence that they made people angry enough to pursue maximum penalties. Sometimes the absolute best way to get out of trouble is fully accepting you're in trouble and dealing with consequences honestly instead of making everything infinitely worse with stupid lies. Subscribe if you want more proof that terrible excuses consistently make situations infinitely worse than necessary. And remember that when caught doing something wrong, sometimes just admitting it honestly is genuinely the least painful option available to you.